Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. Thank you all for joining us here at the Global Europe program. We are having a discussion today on how to make seized Russian financial assets work for Ukraine. And this event is part of our Ukraine in Europe online series, which examines issues that are critical to Ukraine's European future. You can access previous episodes in this series on our Global Europe webpage, and I urge you to do that. There are several already in the hopper, and there will be more to follow. This series is created and led by Dr. Mariana Budjeryn, a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center. She is a senior research associate with the Project on Managing the Atom at Harvard University's Belfer Center, and her research focuses on nonproliferation, arms control, nuclear crises, and post-Soviet nuclear history. Her latest book is called Inheriting the Bomb, the Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine. So we are very lucky to have her as a specialist leading this series. Mariana has brought together today a distinguished panel of experts to help us look at how Russia's financial assets can be accessed and used to help power Ukraine's future. Mariana, I'm going to hand it over to you to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin, for this kind introduction. And thank you. Thanks to the audiences for joining us this morning. And I'm delighted to introduce this great panel of experts that agreed to give us, to join us for a discussion and give us the lay of the land and discuss some of the main challenges and opportunities when it comes to over $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets that have been frozen within the Western financial system. And now the international community, I suppose, are looking for ways to make this money work for the support of Ukraine. And this is a $300 billion question of how to do it. And with me to discuss this important issue are fantastic experts and people who have contributed in salient ways to not only to the discussion but to finding ways, legal, political ways, to tackle this issue. It's unprecedented in its scope, I suppose. We'll start off the discussion, and then later on, perhaps a half an hour into it, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So please use the question function on the streaming service that you're using, and I will parlay them to our speakers. So let me first briefly introduce our panel. We're delighted to welcome Philip Zelikow, who is a Bota Chen Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Dr. Zelikow, for 25 years, chaired a professorship in history at the University of Virginia. And before that, he taught at Harvard University, has a very distinguished academic, but also policy and government career. And most importantly, Dr. Zelikow directed 3 successful bipartisan national commissions, including the 9/11 commission. We are also joined here by Yulia Ziskina. She's a senior legal fellow with the non-profit organization Razum for Ukraine, and she's an attorney at Quinn Emanuel Urquhart and Sullivan, if I'm pronouncing that right. She specializes in financial enforcement and public international law, and has written extensively and contributed on the question, in particular, of Russian sovereign assets frozen in the West. Last but certainly not the least, we are joined here by Tatiana Khutor. She's a chairwoman of the Institute of Legislative Ideas. That's an independent Ukrainian legal think tank that works on anti-corruption issues and sanction policy analysis. She's a visiting professor of practice at the Schlar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University here in the United States. With that, let me ask Philip to start us off with just explaining to the audience and to me, and actually, because I'm not an expert in this issue. What is at stake here? What sort of money are we looking at? How did they end up in the Western financial institutions, this Russian cash? And where is it exactly parked? And what are the main institutional financial players in this situation? Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mariana, and glad to join all of you this morning. So we're confronting here an extraordinary circumstance that I think is unique in world history. Russia carried out the largest international aggression since the Second World War. At the time it did that, it complacently had hundreds of billions of dollars in its foreign exchange holdings that were being held in the very law-abiding states that resented Russia's aggression. That's never happened before. So then the law-abiding states promptly decided, shocked, horrified by Russia's aggression, they promptly decided they would freeze these Russian assets that were sitting in their jurisdictions, worth something in the neighborhood of $300 billion. Mostly, by the way, at the time, almost all of it in various kinds of short-term securities like treasuries, which have now mostly matured and turned into cash in a variety of currencies. And mostly held in what were called central securities depositories, which is kind of a place in which you can park foreign exchange holdings, mostly in non-cash form. But then as they've matured into cash, these depositories then find themselves, since they're prohibited from doing any transactions in them, essentially just kind of taking the cash and say, well, what do we do with this? Let's just put this in a cash account in our company and wait to be told what to do with it. So that's now happened with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of sterling, euros, dollars, and so forth. So you have this extraordinary circumstance. Now, meanwhile, the international community has completely agreed that Russia is an international outlaw and that Russia should pay for the damages it has done not only to Ukraine, but to others. So they've agreed on that. They have said that. They have said the money will not go back to Russia unless and until Russia's victims, and above all Ukraine, have been compensated. Okay? So you have a fairly clear situation in which there's no plausible scenario in which the money goes back to Russia unless Russia basically gives up and agrees to compensate Ukraine and agrees that all its money can be used for this. I know of no expert who thinks this is likely to happen in the foreseeable future. So this enormous sum of money, this game-changing sum of money, which could actually determine the outcome of the war, thus sits there idle. There are only two lawful places it can go. It can either go back to the aggressor, to Russia, or it can go to Russia's victims. There are no other lawful recipients of this money. So, but it stands there idle because the countries whose jurisdiction there is are kind of paralyzed and divided over what to do. Some of the European governments, you'll hear, including in today's newspapers, European governments, above all the French and Germans, who are saying that we think this might violate international law if we just take it and distribute it to the victims. And we worry that it'll damage the financial system. The international law arguments have actually been addressed now by team after team of the most prominent international lawyers in the world. And because it's actually quite permissible under international law for states to take countermeasures against an international outlaw. And yes, under normal circumstances, a sovereign state could complain if you took its property and could seek compensation. But when the sovereign state is an outlaw, you're not obliged to pay them for the taking, to put it very simply. And that point has been made again and again, as I say, by this teams of lawyers, including many from Europe, including from France and Germany. But so folks have this line, then they talk about the danger to the euro. The interesting thing is the shock to the financial system, including the euro, was actually when the assets were frozen in the first place. So, and by the way, Russia has lost the use of hundreds of billions of its property. If there was a legal basis for Russia to challenge that, it already would have done so. Or to seek compensation, which Russia has not even attempted to do, though it's trying to work on some stratagems now to overcome its legal obstacles. But what's lying beneath the surface here are a lot of other concerns that are mostly not voiced. They are concerns about Russian retaliation against various investments, like Russian retaliation against Japanese LNG investments and supplies from Siberia, Russian retaliation against German companies and interests. There are threats from third countries, including Arab countries, not to go along with seizing Russian assets because a lot of other countries fear about the precedent this sets. It says if the West shows that it can use its enormous leverage over foreign exchange holdings against international outlaws, who knows what other international outlaw they might target next? Oh my God, if China invaded Taiwan, they might do something. Now, some people don't think this is a horrifying deterrent, this is a bad thing, but this is the environment we're in right now. The French and Germans in particular at the moment, though the German government is divided and opinion in France is divided, they have dug in their heels and are fiercely refusing to let any money be used, well, except maybe the interest that one of the depositories is earning on the giant cash pile. And they have a theory under which the interest on the cash pile actually isn't Russian property, so maybe it can just be completely taxed by Europe and used for something. They're debating what. And then there are schemes about how to take advantage of that interest flow within the European parameters of what might be allowed to do with the Russian assets. Some of us, including others on this panel, believe we need to step up to the primal issues here and organize this in a serious way, not only to transform, rebuild Ukraine, show Ukraine staying power, but also actually to change the whole outlook on Europe's economic recovery from this war. And so that there's actually an enormous upside if this money is properly put to work, instead of, as it is right now, simply sitting idle with no prospect of going back to Russia and no current plan to use it to save beleaguered Ukraine.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to sort of outline the scope and the unprecedented sort of set of circumstances that we're facing here with this with a lot of $300 billion. If I could just have a quick follow-up question with you, Philip. How does you speak to differences between US and Europe, perhaps on this? Where is the bulk of the money parked? And I remember listening to you once talk about the flow of this cash right in the lead up to the war, and you were saying that if we just follow the money, that there was a very clear indication what was in the offing. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. All right. I'm so glad you asked, Mariana. There is a myth out there that why are the Americans prating about this since almost all of the money is in Europe? Well, actually, that's not true. So the commonly believed presumption, which actually was repeated yesterday by none other than Christine Lagarde, is that, well, there's only about 5 billion of this in the United States. So why is the tail trying to wag the giant European dog? Well, actually, probably in my view, something like 100 billion worth of the 300 billion is actually not in Europe. It's not sitting in Europe. It's actually sitting in the banks of the countries that issued the currencies. If you hold US dollars in cash, the only banks that can hold that cash are US banks. The same is true for sterling, the same is true for Canadian dollars, Australian dollars, etc. You can have an offshore bank account for various reasons, sometimes in some cases, not entirely legitimate reasons. But if you hold a foreign currency, the currency is actually held in a bank in the currency issuing country. And very large amounts of this money are not in euros. They are in US dollars, pound sterling, Canadian dollars, and others, just enormous sums, certainly sums quite sufficient to meet Ukraine's needs over the next 2 or 3 years. So by the way, and that money is not literally in Europe. It is literally in the correspondent banks. There are offshore accounts, somewhat serendipitously created in the case of the depositories in order to put the cash that they actually weren't even supposed to have. But all that cash is actually not located in Belgian banks. It's located in banks in the currency issuing countries. There's actually an enormous amount of money that's actually in the legal jurisdiction of the United States, Britain, Canada, others, if and when they choose to exercise that jurisdiction. So that's a very interesting point, and it will be a distressing conversation in Europe if folks begin talking about the actual jurisdiction over the money, but I'm afraid that conversation may be coming.
All right, well, thank you so much. That makes the story even more interesting and more complicated, I'm afraid. I'll turn to Tatiana next. Tatiana, we talk about repurposing this money for support for Ukraine. What is it? What are some of the uses that have been discussed? Is it for rebuilding? Is it a short term? Should this question be successfully decided, are there any kind of immediate or short-term prospects of using this money to support Ukraine right now? I mean, we see that donor countries like the United States have held the supplemental bill now for several months, and Ukraine is really crunched for support. If you could outline what repurposing might mean and what perhaps also some of the differences between different jurisdictions and different countries like the United States or the European Union might be on that issue. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. Since the time is limited and the issue is very complex, I will not dwell into what has already been partially mentioned by Philip. And in fact, let's start from this kind of support and what this support may cover and what Ukraine wants to cover this with this money. In fact, there is like immediate and long-term needs, and we want to cover both. Immediate first and the long term after that. So and this money, these needs are just includes the budget deficit, the rapid recovery, the defense need, the reconstruction, and the compensation to victims. So let's look at the figures. In 2024 alone, Ukrainian authorities estimate the country will need around $15 billion for immediate reconstruction and recovery priorities. So moreover, Ukraine's 2024 budget allocates nearly $40 billion, is roughly half of its total expenses to defense. So, and which is almost entirely will be covered by taxation. And that leaves hefty bill of some like $40 billion to ensure the rest of state apparatus for keep functioning. So we're talking about social security transfers to the healthcare system, etc. So according to the International Monetary Fund data, Ukraine would need at least 37 billion in external support this year. So most of which will come from EU and US. So the dependence of Ukraine's budget on external support cannot be overstated. Now these needs are covered by 8 of the partners, and of course they voluntarily shouldered this burden, but wouldn't it be fair to cover all those needs at the expense of the frozen funds and not to settle European and American taxpayers with the burden on one hand and make Ukraine a hostage of political disputes in Western countries on another hand? So therefore, it's reasonable to use Russian money for the immediate needs, and as soon as those needs are covered, to allocate the rest of the long-term reconstruction goals. So, and on not only reconstruction. So, according, as you know, I think many people already know that according to the rapid damage needs assessment, it was released by government of Ukraine, the World Bank, and the European Commission, and the UN. As of 31st of December 2023, the total cost of reconstruction recovery in Ukraine is $486 billion. So we have to take into account that in the early April, the International Register of Damages has launched, and it was open for the submission of claims. And Ukrainians who lost their residential property have already started submitting their claims to the register. As for now, we have around 1,300 of claims that were submitted to the register. So in total, at least 300,000 applications are expected to be filled to the register only for this category of losses alone. And it must be mentioned that there will be more than 40 categories in total. So we have to expect what we'll have to deal with in the future. And we have to understand that this register is the only first element of the future compensation mechanism, and this this compensation mechanism will include compensation fund and compensation commission, and they are not created yet, but we expect them to be created in the future. And this compensation fund will need to be replenished with money for the victims to have actual compensation and not just to certificate their losses. And Russian money could be a source and must be a source of replenishing this future fund. Thus, the needs to cover the budget deficit, rapid recovery, defense needs, reconstruction, and compensation for victims are much greater than all of frozen Russian money that we have now. So we can talk a little bit about the how we're just what can we expect, how we can cover this needs, and whether we can cover this needs as for now. So talk a little bit about the principal, sum, or interest. Yes, the main discussion here. And as for today, there are several ideas that are circulating on how we can use this Russian money. In particular, there is I think 5 or 4 main options are conceivable as for now. So the first option is, of course, direct transfer of the assets to Ukraine. Obviously, this is the most favorable option for Ukraine and the most obvious in terms of the legal concerns that Philip has a little bit mentioned and the legal grounds for it. So, and in this case, we can get around $300 billion. Just the sum differs, depends on the source, but $260, $300 billion. So the second option is the transfer of the proceeds from the assets to Ukraine. The most recent proposal that is based on this model was released by Ursula von der Leyen and envisaged a plan to skim off the profits secured by investing the assets and worth about $2.5–3 billion per year, with 90% of the proceeds going to buy weapons for Ukraine. In this case, firstly, Ukraine would not be able to get a full sum of money, the full principal. And secondly, Ukraine won't be able to choose the direction of funding. So this argument is confirmed by today's statement of Prime Minister of Ukraine. He said that Ukraine will insist that the assets would be used to rebuild Ukraine, including the repair of energy facilities damaged by Russia missile strike on Ukraine, a recent strike. So this is the problem. And in addition, this approach misses the opportunity to regulate profits collected by Euroclear for the past periods. In 2022-2023, estimated amount of which is around 5 billion euros, what is a substantial difference and a substantial sum for Ukraine. So there is another model, the third option is the transferring of taxes charged on the process. This model is already just working. It's used by Belgium, but in this case, the sum is so like there is a big difference between what we can expect getting using this the first two options and what we can get and what we're getting here. It's like the sums is estimated on hundreds of millions instead of billions. So, and the fourth option is using to use the assets as collateral to ensure that Russia fulfills its obligation to compensate for the damage. Connected to this idea is like the most recent is the option to raise tens of billions of euros in debt for Ukraine secured against the future profits generated by Russia's state assets that have been frozen by Western countries. And the idea is to maximize the value of the future interest stream of immobilized assets. So it sounds weird a little bit. Because why? Because European officials said that this bond could deliver between 30 and 40 billion euros based on the estimated profits from the Russian assets, but the sum it would be just get out of could be get over the next 10 years. And the estimated sum for like 15–20 years is around 50–60 billion euros. So, and it depends on the future interest rates. So, in fact, there is a lack of support from the head of the EU Central Bank, but as for today, from what I know, this is the most likely scenario, and this is the most recent and the most likely scenario. But we have to understand that it's not favorable and fair for Ukraine for several reasons. First of all, this 30–40 billion euros that they are promising to raise against these profits will be spread over many years. So in fact, according to optimistic forecasts, Ukraine will be able to receive 3–4 billion per year. Instead of simply transferring these profits to Ukraine, which could invest this in maybe more favorable interest rates, for some reason, countries keep them in their management. Second is depending on the scheme that will be used instead of just transferring this money, it may lead to the significant risk of Ukraine's debt and making Ukraine responsible for paying interest. So of course it depends on the scheme, but still the risk is there. So thus this decision will have two negative consequences, may have two negative consequences. First, Ukraine will receive less than it could have received by simply get these profits. The adoption of such a model creates a risk of closing the negotiation window to recover the larger amount amount of assets. And so this option falls short of in furnishing Ukraine with necessary funds for its survival, let alone the amount required for reconstruction or providing victims of compensation and reparation. So the main takeaway from this is that using the proceeds must not be alternative, but a supplement to using the principal sum. So it's like, I think the main thing that I want to mention regarding your first question. So it's like main ideas here.
Great. No, this was an excellent layout of all the different options and mechanisms that are being considered. And with that, let me turn to Yulia to, kind of discuss for us between these different possible solutions, where does international law stand on these various options? Do we have enough international legal tools? I mean, Philip started us off saying these assets are in Western law-abiding countries, so whatever is done with them has to be done in a law-abiding way. And have there been precedents for such asset seizure and repurposing? Will this be a precedent-setting kind of event, whatever happens in the end? If you can give us an idea from that international legal aspect.
Sure, thank you. As my colleagues have already mentioned, yes, international law already allows for this. We have a doctrine called state countermeasures that is specifically aimed at situations exactly like this, where institutions like the UN Security Council have failed to uphold their charge to protect international peace and security. It would be frankly very crazy to say, well, there's simply nothing we can do to hold Russia accountable to pay the compensation it owes. Thankfully, that's not the case. Countermeasures essentially means that when a state's misconduct is so egregious that it violates the very core norms of international law, like such as what happened here, it's considered to affect the entire global community, and any state has the right, and arguably even the duty, to take countermeasures against it. We already have this. So countermeasures by definition are state acts that would ordinarily be wrongful, such as interfering with sovereign property. But the wrongfulness of that act is precluded because the action is taken against an aggressor for its serious violation of international law. And actually freezing the assets themselves was a countermeasure, even though countries don't like to define it that way, it was. Seizing them would simply be another type of countermeasure. However, on the domestic national level, that's each individual country will necessarily have its own legal mechanisms. Or if it doesn't, those legal mechanisms can be created because that is the job of lawmakers. By using an example, for example, in the US, the International Economic Powers Act. This delegates authority to the executive branch to deal with political questions, such as relations between states. This includes freezing, seizing, and transferring assets. So this is an existing legal mechanism that the US has already used to seize and transfer assets, which I'll cover a little bit later into your question about precedent. And it can also use here to seize not only the 5 billion, as we've heard this number being thrown around, but also the billions of dollars in correspondent banks through Euroclear, like Philip has mentioned. So the US can already do this with no new legislation and with its existing mechanisms. But even so, there's a bill in Congress right now called the Repo Act, which clarifies this authority. It removes any ambiguity and it provides political cover. I do want to talk a little bit about the roadblocks to this. So you may be wondering, okay, why then don't we do this? Even though legal experts have already established the legality, and it's not really a legal question anymore. The real roadblocks are political will, which is closely tied to a failure to understand the threat from Russia and the risks if Ukraine is allowed to fail. This gives rise to these very pervasive misconceptions, or as I like to call them, convenient excuses, some of which we've already talked about. And this is very convenient for the Kremlin. And in fact, Russia relies on this kind of perception manipulation. So in terms of understanding where these roadblocks come from, I want to provide like a bit of a broader framework. And that broader framework is the Russian strategy that really matters the most here and is applicable to these frozen assets too, is its ability to cause us to see the world like it wants us to see it, and to make decisions according to those terms. And this is where this self-deterrence comes in. The big goal is to make us think that the risks in helping Ukraine defend itself, and let alone win, are higher than the risks of failure in Ukraine for the United States. So in other words, it's just too costly, it's too risky, and well, the risk to the dollar is just too high. And this narrative really underlies a lot of the self-defeating narratives that we consistently hear and which have been continuously debunked from lawyers, from economists, including the one about undermining the dollar and the euro, which has been shown to be overblown. In fact, the bigger risk on the reserve currency front, speaking of the euro, is if the West fails to adequately fund Ukraine, which results in it losing the war. That would be a huge hit to the security of Europe, where Russia will inevitably invade next. And this would actually deflate confidence not in just the euro, but the stability of Europe itself. So these misconceptions have found their way into legitimate arguments in public debate, and this is why we're seeing so many articles come out from seemingly legitimate scholars. So we need to be very cautious about and aware to the degree that the Kremlin seeks to weaponize our own internal discussions and disagreements to protect itself from the consequences of its actions. But yes, I do want to say the starting point then, how do we get past this? Well, the starting point needs to be, we need to reconnect with our own interests in this war and with the ground truths of this war. And what are those? One is that the cost of failure in Ukraine would be catastrophic. So the starting point in preventing this needs to be, what does Ukraine need to function? What are Ukraine's needs? What is the cost and how do we fill that cost? And we need to be clear about why full confiscation and not just these alternative proposals, like the interest proposal, the collateralization proposal, why full confiscation is legally and practically the most elegant solution to get Ukraine what it needs. None of these other proposals fill the gap. Number-wise, they just don't. The second way is to reframe this as a global security decision. It is not just a discussion about finances and about banks. It is based on global security, same as every other aspect of Russia's war in Ukraine. I do want to touch on the precedent question that you asked, and we frequently hear that, well, there's no precedent for this, and that is untrue. In fact, a good example of a precedent is after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the US and other countries adopted countermeasures against Iraq, and they suspended its immunity, if you want to call it that, in order to compensate the victims of Iraq's aggression. Those frozen Iraqi state funds were transferred to an international compensation mechanism that was set up for the victims. So you might hear that the main difference is that this example was done pursuant to a UN Security Council resolution, and that claims commission was ultimately set up through the UN. But obviously, we don't have the UN Security Council here because the aggressor sits on the UN Security Council. But what we do have is a resolution from the UN General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace mechanism, which is somewhat of a substitute for the UN Security Council in situations like this. And that gives member states the legal standing to take those third-party countermeasures. Countermeasures are meant to be decentralized acts of state, and they are not necessarily dependent on Chapter 7 processes. So we already have the mechanisms here. But regarding precedent, there's another bigger point to keep in mind when you hear this question, and that is when people say there's no exact precedent or they nitpick distinctions between precedent, that to me is a very weak and a very silly point to make. That's because history doesn't give us a precise blueprint. That's because some things are just simply unprecedented, exactly like the situation we have here. So that said, this is an opportunity to create the precedent that we want. This is a good precedent. Transferring Russian state assets would be a deterrent against future crimes of aggression. It would protect the international rules-based order against unprovoked aggression. It would hold the aggressor accountable, and it would support victims. The irony is that, well, conduct like Russia's right now is fortunately very rare, and that's why we don't have precedent. But the irony is that unless we respond to it appropriately, that might not remain the case. So the reality here is that no matter what, we are forced to set a precedent for the future, either by inaction or action. So the decisions that we take today matter. We can choose to do nothing. We can choose to pursue half measures like this interest proposal or the collateralization proposal, which doesn't give Ukraine all that it needs. Or we can build a strong precedent for the future, which will define our collective values moving forward. It's a bigger question than just how will the markets respond, but we need to start thinking about what this actually means for international law and for global peace and security. So I think that's the correct way to start thinking about this.
Oh, fantastic, Yulia. This was really powerful and helpful in understanding. You know, we do have actually some questions from the audience, and the one of the ones was, you know, if international law is settled on this, or at least largely, so what are the roadblocks? And I think you already tackled that question rather comprehensively. Let me take some more questions that we have coming in, and some of them you've already touched upon, so please feel free to choose whichever aspects you still feel might need more elucidation. So there's a question from Adam Blanco, Managing Director of EAQ Technologies, that says law-abiding governments will not be affected by the confiscation of CBR reserves. Short of confiscation, we can use reserves as collateral bonds, for example, CAT bonds, with proceeds directed to Ukraine. I think we discussed the opportunities and perils of collateralization already, but if there's something more to be said about that, please feel free. But let me just field another question from Judith Mandel, Foreign Service Officer. There is some concern among the European governments about transferring money directly to Ukraine that's connected with corruption, or perhaps these funds not being used, you know, in the most transparent way. If you can perhaps speak to that and see if, you know, what possible mechanisms could be put in place to prevent that from happening. Any of you would like to take these on?
Sure, Ms. Mandel's question is relatively straightforward. All the proposals to do this would transfer the money into some sort of international compensation fund that would create an intermediary that would manage the distribution of funds in an appropriate way, probably using existing institutions like the World Bank and others to manage it. So in practice, all the proposals that would actually do this will not just simply dump hundreds of billions of dollars in the Ukrainian treasury. They will create some sort of intermediary that will manage this. I want to come back to the issue of collateralization, because people, especially people who are entranced by the financial engineering, can run down many different explorations of how to play around with this. And in fact, the fundamental issue is you can't collateralize property that you don't own. So the fundamental point in any scheme is, first you've got to make the decision to transfer the assets into some sort of international management, into some sort of asset management structure. Then after that, it really then is just a set of practical questions of the kind Tatiana was alluding to, of how much money do you need in year 1, year 2, year 3, for what different purposes, and what's the best asset management approach to produce that amount of money. But fundamentally, all the bond schemes or other schemes involve some underlying ownership of the property that you're leveraging. So you have to fundamentally make the decision about countermeasures and to organize the money. And then after that, we can have lots and lots of discussions about how best to manage the assets in order to provide a sustainable source of support in the right amounts in given years.
Great. I see Yulia, you have a comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit more about this collateralization because it's the leading proposal right now, and I would really like to hammer in this point. So fundamentally, and it's just practically, the scenario is this. You freeze the 300 billion, not seize them, as Philip pointed out, which is actually necessary in order to collateralize them. And for at least the next 10 years, you tell investors that we want you to buy bonds guaranteed by the reparations that supposedly Putin will one day voluntarily pay. Or if Putin doesn't pay, then we guarantee you our promise that we think maybe we'll use these reserves to pay you back, even though we're too scared to take them now. So I don't know, maybe we'll take them in the future. But we still can't promise you that. So effectively, the collateral isn't the assets themselves, it is the promise to take the assets. And it is the promise that we haven't done anything on for the past 2 years. So my question to you as an investor would be, how much money would you like to lend against this type of collateral? And even if you were to lend, what would that interest rate be? This isn't very well thought through, and by trying to be financially clever and trying to avoid actually a much more simple, legally straightforward solution, which is confiscating the assets based on countermeasures, you're actually making it financially, legally, practically more complicated and creating more problems, not just for yourself, but for Ukraine.
Yeah,
Thank you.
the fundamental European reluctance, or the reluctance of a handful of Europeans, because actually quite a few European countries want to go ahead with this full speed. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which represents not only the full EU, but represents practically every country in Europe, including Switzerland, voted unanimously this week on a resolution to take the Russian assets. So there's a wide opinion in Europe that wants to do this. So but because a group of people in Europe are opposed doing this, countries are twisting themselves into pretzel shapes to try to find devices by which they can extract some value from the Russian assets without crossing any of these lines. And as Yulia eloquently pointed out, it's actually much more straightforward, including legally straightforward, to just go ahead and step up to the issue of countermeasures that you, as she also pointed out, stepped up to anyway when you froze the assets in the first place. You know, you've already crossed that Rubicon as a legal matter. So this is then the next logical step. But there's a level at which people are reluctant to take the step, partly for reasons of economic interest that they don't wish to discuss publicly, and fears of Russia, or sympathy for Russia that they also don't wish to discuss publicly. But also just actually a deep level of just innate psychological caution and inertia, which in some ways is the most powerful factor that the three of us are fighting right now, is just sort of a residual, well, I don't know, it seems like a big deal. And what I liked so much about what Yulia was saying is that you're making a choice here. It says that caution itself is a choice in which, well, you know, maybe Ukraine should just die because we're too cautious about doing something that might cause a problem. It's just a psychological instinct to risk aversion, but without recognizing the cataclysmic consequences of failing to make this choice.
Yes, very well put. Philip, I was just talking yesterday about the nuclear consequences of this crisis, a very different aspect of the whole thing. And even, you know, I hear these reverberations across many different dimensions of the consequences of this. Here we talked financial, but there's a lot more on the other fronts. Tatiana, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I would just like want to add something about corruption, as I work with anti-corruption in Ukraine. And we have to understand that existing practices of transferring Russian money, so far we are talking about the money from sanction evasion only. And these money are connected with the use of the platforms, international platforms, such as international organizations, special funds, special projects, or funds of in other countries. So when it comes to a larger compensation mechanism, there is a reason why this scheme that were chosen for this, for international compensation mechanism, was invented in that way, just to involve international partners, but not just to involve, but to give them the major role in this process. Because Ukraine said that, okay, you can manage it. You have to meet our needs, and you can manage it however you want, in the most transparent way you want. In this case, we have to remember that according to the intelligence data, Russia will have this issue, the corruption issue, #1 in their propaganda for this year. And we'll hear about it more and more times in this year. So as for now, it seems that the issue of corruption is now may be used only in the way to avoid decision-making process in this particular issue. So we have to remember it.
I want to come back to the corruption issue for just a moment, because I want to say something about this that Ukrainians can't say. Yeah, they have their issues, but boy, there are plenty of issues in Europe and the West, and including on this issue. The Russians are exerting influence on this issue in ways that are deeply corrupt and are not very visible. Though those of us who've been working this beat now for the last couple of years can see it. And that corruption doesn't get called out quite as much. But that corruption is, in my view, much more powerful and pervasive, including on this issue in Europe, than anything we would have to worry about in the Ukraine that's currently fighting for its life. So, as a non-Ukrainian, I think it's worth calling that out, and I can say that.
Thank you for saying that, Philip. We appreciate you being the only non-Ukrainian sort of on this in this lineup here. It is much appreciated, and if I just might add from myself, I mean, we are all very well aware of the challenges Ukraine has faced over the years. With issues of corruption. But one of the reasons we're hearing so much about it, I mean, in addition to the Russian propaganda, is because there are NGOs, there's efforts, national, mostly a lot of them from Ukrainian civil society, not just from, outside pressures, to ferret out these schemes, to really introduce transparency into Ukrainian political system. So partially that's why we hear about it, and hearing about it is in a way a good thing that way. Let me just grab a couple more questions here. We have James Nixie, the director for Russia and Eurasia program at the Chatham House think tank in the UK, who voices his agreement with this panel, but asks about Russian countermeasures. Philip, you touched upon a little bit on the things Russia can do in response, but also mobilize courts and legal sophistry, as James Nixie puts it, something that oligarchs have done successfully in the past to at least stall the process. Another question we have here from Pavlo Pushkar, who congratulates us on the presentation and ask whether regimes of countermeasures and sanctions are sufficient for the purposes you discussed, or would we need something new and more innovative in the process? There's another question from Marcia McGraw-Olive, who's a John Hopkins SAIS, who says the funds are clearly insufficient for all of Ukraine's present needs, but what criteria should the international community consider short versus long-term priorities, and how would it affect the potential to compensate individual losses? Tatiana, I see you have your hand up, so you go ahead and tackle any of the questions you care to first.
I will start off addressing the first one regarding the contractions and litigations. Philip has already talked about the part of this issue. I would just like to mention one thing, that Russia has already made its moves trying to fight back. And to be honest, the Russian government began the process of confiscating, of seizing Western companies' assets long before Western countries started to talk about confiscation of Russian assets seriously. Let's be honest in it. So Moscow has taken control over many Western companies, Carlsberg, Danone, Fortum, Uniper, and many others. So, and we have to understand that many of these companies have been put under the control of Putin's cronies, the Russian oligarchs. So as for now, and of course, it's inevitable that the aggressor will try to resist the pressure and try to retaliate. It's obvious, but we have to bear in mind that Russia, if Russia wins, Western economies might lose much more. And it's one point. Another point about litigations. As for the February, the beginning of 2024, Russian organizations has filed more than 90 lawsuits against Euroclear, demanding the return of funds. For example, we may talk about the lawsuit of VTB Bank against Euroclear for the around $38 million. We can talk about Russia's oldest asset management, First AM company. It has filed a claim for $2 billion. But the most of litigation is happening in Russian courts. So they are filing this claims in Russian courts. So as this sanctions has been imposed by international and foreign institutions, not Russian, the Russian court shall not have jurisdiction to decide on the legitimacy of the imposed sanctions. So, and talking about the international jurisdiction, there is like an irony there. So where Russia can go, International Court of Justice, and the irony is that it has ignored the decision of this court to suspend military operation in Ukraine. So it's like another question here. So
to undermine the very system that it might have served it for the litigation. Actually, you mentioned Euroclear, and Yulia, before I turn to you, there is actually a question about the 210 billion of reserves that are with Euroclear, a Belgian depository and clearinghouse. For those of us who are not familiar with these institutions. So the question is from Adam Blanco, from EAQ Technologies. How does Euroclear protect its own integrity as a private business? This would require the EU or the Belgian government to force a confiscation by law. And what stops EU, Belgium from acting? Yulia, would you care to tackle that together with some other questions?
Sure. I just wanted to add on to what Tatiana was saying about Russian litigation. I guess the only other feasible venue for litigation I could probably think of is Russia suing in the national courts of a state that confiscated its assets. But that's probably even more ridiculous than it going to the ICJ, because in order to do that, it would be waiving its sovereign immunity. And it's not in its interest to be litigating in a Western country's courts, especially one that has levied historic sanctions against it. And even, I also want to make the bigger point that even if Russia sues, the countries that are taking the assets in their jurisdictions wouldn't be taking those assets for their own enrichment. They are taking them for the purpose of compensating the victims with the money that Russia already legally owes. So it's very unlikely to show that that kind of confiscation is unreasonable or unjustified, or that the countermeasure was unlawful. So yes, it may try to sue it wherever it wants. Maybe it finds something creative, but the bigger question is the strength of the case. And here, the strength of the case is very, very strong. I don't want to forget, I think Pavlo's question about, do we need something else in international law, something above countermeasures? Frankly, I don't think so. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we have what we need here. We just need to make the decision to use it. In terms, and this is specifically in terms of seizing those assets. If it's something else, such as holding Russia accountable for its numerous war crimes, a tribunal, yes, let's create something specifically for that regard. But for seizing the assets, we have what we need. We just need to use it.
That sounds loud. That's a loud and clear message that's coming out of this panel, I see. We only have just a minute or so left. Philip, would you tackle question of Euroclear real quick before we adjourn?
Yeah, it's interesting, the situation with Euroclear and also the clearinghouse called Clearstream that's based in Luxembourg. Because the Russian central bank and the similar entities have now been so thoroughly sanctioned, they are now in violation of the rules for participation in Euroclear at all. Euroclear now is no longer allowed to do business with these entities under Euroclear Bank's own rules. Also, the Russian assets that Euroclear was originally protecting have now basically turned into cash, which Euroclear has been forced to deposit because they have no other place to put them. So the depositories are in the position where these depositors have now violated their rules and they're not allowed to do business with them anymore under the kind of know your customer rules that banks have. Also, they've put their money into cash, for which they don't have any asset protection guidelines or any governing contract from the depositor. So Euroclear really needs some kind of guidance as to how to unload this money. And there are only two places you can unload it. You can either give it back to the criminal, or you can look for some way it gets distributed to the victims with international guidance. So if Euroclear understands its legal obligations correctly, it needs some outside authority to basically take charge of these cash deposits and move them into some other depository. Now that Euroclear Bank is no longer really allowed under its own rules to do business with the Central Bank of Russia, really under any circumstances.
All right. Well, thank you so much for making it clear. We are at the end of our time, although certainly not at the end of interest and all the fascinating really aspects of this unprecedented case of Russian frozen assets. And I am very grateful for you to all of you for participating in this panel, but also more broadly for engaging in this, for offering your expertise and making efforts in resolving this question towards Ukraine's satisfaction and frankly speaking, towards the demands of international justice more broadly. Thank you all so much. With that, we are ending our webinar. Thank you all of you who joined and who posed questions online. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.